Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the latest webinar in our 2020 Cybersecurity series. We will be recording this session. Today, we will be discussing the topic, Adopting Risk-Based Cybersecurity at Your Organization, with our special guest, Levi Gundert, the Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at Recorded Future. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. As your questions come up, please navigate to the Q&A section of the taskbar and write them in there. While many of you listening today are long-term customers, some of you may not know as much about us. Access IT is the premier security VAR on the East Coast. We have been assisting clients for over 2 decades from 3 distinct professional services practices. We have dozens of highly trained, product-certified engineers providing custom security solutions within our technical services, cloud services, and risk management practices. At the end of today's presentation, we will share how you can contact Access IT to support your security needs. And now, Access IT would like to introduce Levi Gundert. Levi?
Thanks so much, John. So, I don't think there's too many people on. Basically, the way I was hoping to run this today is if there's questions along the way, feel free to submit them, as John said, in the Zoom question and answer box. But if you have questions that you want to talk about specifically after a certain slide or during a certain slide, please feel free to jump in and make a comment or ask a question, and would be happy to engage and have that conversation. So thank you for being here and thank you for your time. I'm really passionate about this topic. I'm fortunate as the SVP of Global Intel at Recorded Future. I'm very fortunate that I get to talk with our clients globally, and I get to both virtually, obviously these days, but previously physically meet with a lot of our clients, over hundreds and hundreds of our clients around the world, and everything from threat intelligence analysts to CISOs. And the one thing that I really picked up, especially over the last 5 years that I've been at Recorded Future, has really been this gap between what cybersecurity teams do and how that gets translated into the language of risk for senior executives and especially the board. So this presentation is really a summary of the book that I recently wrote on this gap and how to approach this gap, and really how everyone in the organization, in the security organization, can feel confident in thinking about how they contribute to risk or the reduction of risk, and how they communicate that efficiently to senior stakeholders. So the takeaways that I have today for you are right here, and you can read them for yourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story and some of the failed paradigms that are not necessarily completely failed, maybe just partially failed. We'll talk about some of the increasing risk that's happening right now in terms of digital transformation, how security intelligence reduces risk, and then finally what moving to a risk-driven security program would look like, and how that's different from some of the other types of security programs that are out there today. So I'll start with sort of my first entry in buzzword bingo here, and if I rewind 15 years, I was a special agent with the U.S. Secret Service. I was working cybercrime cases out of the LA field office, and it was interesting at that time, this is 2005, a lot of what I heard in the industry was defense in depth. We need defense in depth. That's really the key to a successful security program. And a lot of this, it's centered on, multiple vendors, multiple manufacturers for security controls, different types of manufacturers for firewalls or email security appliances or whatever it was. That was sort of the flavor of the day. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the sentiment here. Obviously, it's something that I think as security professionals, we all strive for, and it's a good idea, but in practice, it's very difficult to actually implement. And the reason it's difficult to implement is because adversaries shift tactics quickly. They shift their behaviors, their tool sets, sometimes on a daily basis. So when we think about, adapting to changing TTPs in our world, it's interesting. I compare things to the physical world because obviously in another life, I was responsible for physical protection at Secret Service as well. And the adversary TTPs didn't change that much. So the tools, the tactics, the procedures the adversaries use, they didn't evolve all that much, right? You would, obviously, the advent of 3D printing meant that you could now print a 3D firearm and get, maybe one shot off. So that was a new evolution in the threat space. Another one was drones. So as drones became more adept at flying, longer ranges and carrying heavier payloads, obviously the threat from drones became pretty significant for an organization like the Secret Service in the physical protection mandate. But these sorts of TTPs, they didn't happen every day. They didn't happen every month. It was usually a couple years before you would see a real shift in a TTP or a TTP evolution. And that is the polar opposite of what happens in the cyberspace in our world, where we see adversaries shifting tactics and techniques, sometimes on a daily or weekly basis. And that is, a primary reason why defense in depth is great in theory, but it's really hard in practice, because while you're thinking about, how you're going to obtain multiple layers of defense and go through, procurement and purchasing and all this stuff, the adversary is already shifting to new tactics and techniques that potentially make that strategy obsolete. So the next sort of, in my career, the next buzzword was really proactive intelligence. And threat intelligence wasn't really a commonly understood term, I would say, probably until somewhere between 2012 and 2013, 14, right in that area, especially in the private sector. And so there was this notion that originally, intelligence needs to be proactive. And in the government space, this makes a lot of sense, where you're doing attribution, especially. So this is a report that Record a Future put out a couple of years ago on the actor known as Tessa 88. So we identified him as Maxim Donikov, and he was responsible for a number of the major database breaches, including MySpace, LinkedIn, Twitter, Rambler, and some other ones. So in the public sector, this makes a lot of sense in terms of this type of intelligence having a very clear outcome, a very clear real world outcome, where law enforcement or an intelligence agency or even the military takes very specific actions, and there are very specific decision points that occur, when you're able to generate this type of proactive intelligence. But in the private sector, this kind of intelligence is not super helpful. Obviously, there's a lot of advantages in being proactive, and the whole point with intelligence is that the concept is obviously wanting to move away from constantly being reactive to thinking about, what these TTP evolutions are going to be based on, historical patterns and what we know and what we've seen. But in the private sector, the type of intelligence that is valuable is very different from the government and the private sector. So then, within intelligence especially, we said, well, intelligence has to be actionable. You have to be able to action it. You have to be able to do something with it. And this is one example. I like this example of credential stuffing. So in the previous slide, we looked at what a report on a particular actor looked like, and potentially in the public sector was proactive, but it wasn't particularly actionable. And when you say actionable, that means different things to different people, depending on who's in the room. For me, what this means is that you're able to measure and communicate an outcome, an operational outcome. And if you can't measure it and you can't communicate it, then it's not quote unquote actionable. So in this case, where we have actors selling major databases of stolen credentials, they are going to use tools like Sentry MBA and Sniper and many other ones to programmatically test those credentials against a set of online services to determine, how many of these credentials are still valid, and whether they're, attempting to go after an online service that is streaming movies or music, or whether they're looking to get into financial services accounts, whatever it may be. They're going to use plug and play tools like this to determine whether they can use some percentage of those credentials and or sell those credentials for unauthorized access. So that's great. You look at that and you say, okay, that's nice. I get it. I understand. I see, bad guys are using these types of tools for credential stuffing. That's great. What do I do with that? What am I supposed to do with that? And that's really, the question with intelligence is always, what do I do with it? What's the outcome? How do I measure it? How do I communicate it? So in this case, obviously being able to take these tools apart, being able to understand what network traffic looks like. So when they're generating network traffic and pushing credentials into a web application, what does that look like? What does the profile look like? Can we find unique aspects of the traffic that are profilable? And can we use those to then block future traffic from these types of tools? So the answer is yes. On a lot of these tools, there are very unique pieces of the string, whether it's the user agent or other parts of how they interact with a web server that are profilable and you can block. And the other thing you can do is obviously add certain fields to your form. So if your web application form needs an email address and a password, and you add a last name field to the form, all of a sudden you have literally, you broke, all of these credential stuffing tools, because they don't typically have a last name, right? In the databases that they're using, they typically have a username or an email address, but they don't have a last name. So if they don't have the last name field, then the entire form is broken, and these tools no longer work. So that's really, when we say actionable, that's really what we're talking about. Is we understand how the adversary works, we understand the tools and the tactics, and now we're actually going to be able to implement security controls, whether those are technical controls, process controls, but we're going to implement controls specifically for those types of adversary evolutions. And that's the whole point with threat intelligence. So another, I guess, paradigm or another catchphrase is automation. We all want to automate everything today, and there's good reason for that. We all know that there's a dearth of human resources out there. There's a dearth of time and a dearth of budget, and there's only so many people, right, that are going to be able to work in this space. So anything that we can automate, we obviously do want to automate. And the same goes with intelligence. So when it comes to what I call operational threat intelligence, that means taking a workflow and looking at how it can be automated, or at least minimal, human interaction. So in this case, if we stay with the example of stolen credentials, and we stay with that example, in this case, what we can do is we can automate the surfacing of large credential dumps or breaches. We can do the parsing of the fields and the records. We can do a comparison against the credential sets internal to our organization through Active Directory. And where we have something that is a legitimate credential set, we can automate the password reset process. So there's no reason that a human being really needs to be involved in this process. And this becomes a very powerful workflow. It's what I would call programmatic threat intelligence, and it really acts as a control, just like any firewall would, or any sort of web proxy appliance, because you're now creating a workflow that is acting as a control specifically around credential breaches and credential dumps. And we know that adversaries, they love to use the low-hanging fruit. So where they can gain access into an environment using stolen credentials, that's what they're going to do. They may look for other types of access, vulnerabilities, external facing vulnerabilities, phishing, whatever it may be. But generally, in the actors that we talk to and we do direct engagement with, have told us over and over again that their primary methodology, if they can, is to find existing valid credentials to gain access into a system. So this is what the security control looks like when threat intelligence is actually, part of that solution and becoming a new type of security control. So that's really the paradigms, and that's really some of the buzzwords, that we've been hearing, over the last 10, 15 years, and especially in the intelligence space. And I think, we continue to see evolutions of what optimal intelligence is, both in terms of the consumption and the outcomes. So this brings us to digitalization. And of course, we all know that from a marketing perspective, there's a lot of fluff in terms like this, and it can mean, everything and nothing at the same time. But at this, that being said, there's so many organizations from a technology perspective that are really consumed with maintaining market leader status or achieving market leader status through technology and technology advances. And obviously there's a lot of new technologies that are out there, and we sort of find ourselves in, what I've heard called the fourth industrial revolution. So obviously the first industrial revolution was the 18th century. We now find ourselves sort of in the fourth. And, everyone is working remotely. Everyone is at home, and that is changing, the strategies around digital transformation. So whether it's cloud, Internet of Things, it's 5G, DevOps, secure DevOps, maybe even, blockchain, quantum computing is going to radically change everything when it becomes available in a broad mainstream sort of way. So, I was actually talking to some folks last week, and we were talking about this digital transformation, and they were saying having an entire workforce being moved remotely sort of overnight has had all kinds of challenges, from people wanting to order printers to print things out at home, to how to handle email in purely remote environments. And there's a quote that I saw a couple weeks ago. It was a Bloomberg article. It said, "The global pandemic is an accelerant thrown on the flames of progress," and calling to mind the famous Lenin quote, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And right now, obviously in the COVID environment, it really feels like we're in these weeks where decades are happening, and you have organizations that have 3 to 5 year plans for digital transformation, and they are literally having to condense that into 3 to 5 weeks at the most. So obviously, intelligence becomes really important in the middle of this in terms of understanding adversary behaviors, tactics, tools, techniques, and how those are evolving and shifting as digital transformation is accelerating for pretty much every organization in some way, shape, or form. So what is security intelligence? This is a term that we at Recorded Future defined there, and you can read it for yourself. But the important point for myself is really the improving security outcomes and measurably reducing operational risk. And again, we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes in more specifics and how you do that in terms of the measuring and the communicating. But that's the whole point of security intelligence, is that you're able to produce very hard, crunchy metrics. And those metrics can be communicated about how you're going to decrease operational risk across a lot of different silos within the security organization. So everything from security operations to vulnerability management and everything in between. There should be very specific expectations that you have in terms of what security intelligence is going to do in those respective silos to reduce that risk. So you can pick, I'm not going to read through these, but you can pick any of these, right? And if you're talking to, in my case, if I'm talking to the head of the SOC or the IR, that individual is typically very concerned with how many alerts can be triaged in a given amount of time, right? And quicker verdicts on indicators for the analysts that are clearing glass means that they can actually clear and triage more alerts in a given day. And the same thing goes for the incident response team, where they're responding to actual incidents or infections. If you're talking to somebody in vulnerability management that is responsible for that team, being able to articulate why a certain line of business should be expediting their patching schedule when they're not really inclined to do that, being able to articulate that based on security intelligence is valuable, very valuable, and it's something that you can measure. And it goes for all of these. So third-party exposure, the companies and the vendors that you're doing business with, the tier 1 vendors, being able to work with them when you see changes in their threat profiles. Maybe you're doing mergers and acquisitions evaluations, and being able to understand what risk those third and fourth parties represent is really important. Measuring domain takedowns, measuring the amount of credential resets you're doing. There's a lot of different ways to measure what those outcomes are for each one of the security functions or organizations. So we talked a little bit about operational threat intelligence, and again, on the previous slide, a lot of that is building in security intelligence into existing workflows to turbocharge those workflows and drive those outcomes. But there's also strategic threat intelligence, and the strategic side of this is really where humans are involved. So in the last couple slides where you're talking about what machines can do and what can be automated. And then when you talk about humans and threat intelligence teams, the best thing that those teams can do and the most valuable for the organization is really control validation. It is understanding what an adversary is doing in terms of the TTPs and being able to being aware of what the adversary is doing and using. I call them the 3 A's. So it's awareness, assessment, and amelioration, because I needed a third A to make the 3 A's. So I had to use amelioration there. But what this means is that if you're not, in this case, if you're not aware of Thanos ransomware, if you're not aware that it's using the replace technique, if you're not aware of what the replace technique is, then that's a problem for the organization. Once you actually are aware that there is a new type of ransomware, and you understand it's being sold in various criminal forms, then of course you have to do the assessment. And the assessment is, how do our security controls stack up right now today against this particular strain of ransomware? And that's not an easy question. You can't just check a box and say, well, we have AV, or oh, we have an EDR vendor, and I'm sure they're on top of it. Right? That doesn't work, because while they may have a signature, they may have some sort of detection for it down the road, they may not have it today. And that's really where security intelligence shines, is being able to identify new and evolving adversary TTPs, to be able to do the comparison against your security controls at any given point in time, and to understand where you have gaps and where you have deltas. That is the tip of the spear for a threat intelligence team. Now, I talk to a lot of people in the threat intelligence space, and there are a lot of threat intelligence teams, even within Fortune 100 companies, where the expectation is that the threat intelligence team should produce a daily threat report. And the daily threat report, I used to work at a financial services company myself, so I'm intimately familiar with this process, where the daily threat report essentially turns out to be something close to a regurgitation of secondhand reporting on news and a little bit of sprinkling of some social media and or maybe some podcasts. And these reports, there's no clear consumer of the report. So if somebody is making business decisions, it's not clear, who or how much these reports are influencing the decisions. And essentially, you're creating a product where there is no real measurement, and there really is no communication in terms of the feedback loop on what these reports are producing for the business. So people may read them, they may not read them, but there's no real outcomes. And I think that's a shame, because there's obviously a lot of talented people in the space, and their time is being consumed with those types of daily reports instead of focusing on metrics and reports on a less frequent basis that are all about security control gaps or lack thereof. And I think that is the most powerful thing a threat intelligence team can be doing. So when it comes to how to measure this type of security intelligence workflow, the metrics I came up with are mean time to surface and mean time to assess. Meaning, once an actor posts this, in this case, once an actor posts this on a closed form or a criminal form, how long does it take your security team to become aware of this new ransomware that's being sold? If it was posted yesterday and you become aware of it today, right? It's roughly 24 hours. Can you reduce that time? And then once you're aware of it, how long does it take you to do the assessment? So, today we're aware of Thanos ransomware. It's probably going to take, a team of people a couple of days to actually understand how it works and how host-based and network-based security controls stack up to it, right? But those are two metrics that come out of the incident response world that are very applicable in this case, in this scenario. So another example here, the same thing applies. Giving you another example, this time from an open source. So somebody on Twitter posts a new Python tool called Phantom Evasion, and he posts a link to his GitHub repo or her Git repo, and talks about the fact that Windows Defender does not detect Phantom Evasion. And if you're going to use it, right, with your normal malware, there's all kinds of bells and whistles, and it's this open source tool. So again, it's not just the closed sources, it's not just the criminal sources or the technical sources. A lot of times it's the open sources, and just being able to programmatically maintain awareness of what's happening on a day-to-day basis is a real challenge. And just a third example here. So we obviously see a lot of unauthorized access being sold and auctioned, and this happens on a daily basis across, hundreds of forums. And there's probably, a handful that we take super seriously in terms of the actors and their capabilities and what they've done historically. But, this is the other piece of understanding that sometimes the actors, they're not going to talk about which organization they're compromising specifically, but they will talk about the type of industry or the type of website that they're selling access to. And right now, more than ever, we're seeing that the buyers of these types of access are looking to introduce ransomware, and they're looking to introduce any sort of malicious payload that will allow them to steal data and then extort victims, following the introduction of ransomware. So it's incredibly important to be aware and to be doing these assessments. So a lot of times, I talk to a CISO and they'll ask me, the number one question I hear is, how are we doing in terms of our competition? How do we stack up to our competition? And it's a pretty logical question. I think obviously there's a lot of opportunistic actors out there, and if your environment and your security is a little bit better than the competitors, then it's natural to assume that your competitor is going to experience security events before you do. The problem with this is that there are too many bears out there in the world now, and some of them are opportunistic and some of them are targeted, but it doesn't really matter if you can run faster than the guy next to you, because there are plenty of bears around to chase, not just you and your competitor, but everyone else in your industry segment. So this brings me to risk. And the point here is that the board, they may not understand the language of security. They may not understand the language of technology, but they understand the language of risk. And when we talk about risk, what we're talking about is loss. And so it doesn't really matter if it's, a hit to the brand or it's a disruption to operations. It all boils down to a number. And at the end of the day, that's what the board cares about. Are we going to lose money? And if so, how much? That's all they care about. You can talk all you want about denial of service attacks and ransomware and this and that, but really in their world, in the language of risk, they want it translated into loss, right? That's what they care about. It's what is the loss? There's obviously different types of risk, right? There's a risk of missing out on opportunities, right? Upside risk, but that's not what we're talking about. We're concerned with risk principally in the form of loss. How much money are we going to lose? That's what we care about. So when you talk about models, what I mean by this is when I ask a CISO, what is the goal of the security program? What are you trying to achieve? I typically get answers there's two different themes to them. So the first one is really compliance focused. And the problem with compliance is that, and by the way, I'm not saying there aren't things you have to do for governance and compliance, because obviously there are. And if you want to keep your job, you obviously better pay attention to governance and compliance. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is if that is the end all be all of the security program, and you want to move from a 3 to a 4 on NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001, there's obviously some good things that come out of it, but there's also some pitfalls. So number one is if the compliance framework says go build a fence, and you go build a fence out of bacon, you can check the box, but it's not really the intent of what they're trying to communicate there, right? So if they say, hey, you need a 24/7 SOC, and you outsource it to an organization that's not really capable, yes, you've checked the box, but it doesn't really make the organization any safer or reduce risk. So that's number one. Number two, the compliance frameworks, they don't update super frequently. So again, when you think about adversary TTPs and how fast adversary tactics can change, the compliance frameworks may update annually or even every other year, right? But what we've seen over the years is that organizations that get certified as compliant within a certain framework, maybe it's, PCI DSS, or some of the other ones are breached, right? And they have material security events that impact their operations and their bottom line, weeks to months after they were certified. So obviously there's some good things that come out of compliance frameworks, but it can't be the end all be all of your security program. And the same thing with threat focused security programs. So the problem there is that you potentially are wasting resources on threats that don't actually present risk to your organization because you have mitigating security controls. You already have a well thought out security controls strategy in place for ransomware. Right? You don't necessarily consider a new ransomware family to immediately be a risk to the organization, right? Or maybe you do, but moving quickly on specific threats. The problem there is that you are potentially wasting resources. You're potentially wasting time and potentially wasting money. So the alternative to those types of security programs where from the top down, the focus is compliance or threats is a risk-driven security program. And there's really 3 steps here. So number 1, we talked about understanding your own security controls and where you have gaps, based on security intelligence. And that process is what I call relevant threat deltas, identifying the relevant threat deltas or RTDs, which is there is a new adversary behavior, there is a evolution in the adversary tactic or the technique, and that represents a change. It represents a delta. And doing that analysis with your own security controls means that you can understand where you have gaps. And then once you understand where you have gaps, you can better calculate probabilities and start to quantify the risk. And the whole point here is that communicating something like an annualized loss exposure is a much better way to talk about risk because, again, the board cares about loss. So they don't really care. They don't really know how to translate a report that says, well, that's a medium risk or that's an amber risk, right? Traffic light system, red, yellow, green, or high, medium, low. Well, what does that mean? What does a medium mean? What does medium risk mean? What does high risk mean? How much money are we going to lose if it's a high risk? What does that actually mean? Do I lose more sleep at night? Do I lose less? If I'm a CSO or CIO, what is that supposed to mean? So in my own experience, I have a lot of experience with this, and it's really frustrating because it's difficult to have informed conversations with senior stakeholders when you can't quantify the risk, when you can't talk about things in very specific ways. So there's a framework that I came up with called TCR, which is Threat Category Risk. And TCR is really sort of built on the principles of FAIR, F-A-I-R. For those of you that are familiar with FAIR, you know that it's a risk methodology that attempts to quantify risk. And TCR is basically built off of a book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk by Douglas Hubbard and Richard Searson. And it's a fantastic read. And they make a very compelling case for estimates, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you read it. Again, it's called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. And threat category risk, the framework is really built on that book and the ideas in that book. So if you look at the workflow and how it works, you, number 1, again, have to understand where you have relevant threat deltas. And then what you do is you start creating the inputs to the model. And the inputs are really all about threat categories. And you can be as granular or as high level with the threat categories as you want, but you really have to think through loss. You really have to think through the estimates. So instead of just coming up with numbers and saying, well, what is everyone in our industry knows the equation for risk for a long time has been likelihood of occurrence times impact. But the problem is you put garbage into that, you get garbage out of it. And I've never seen anyone that wasn't putting garbage into it, meaning somebody from GRC, the Governance, Risk, and Compliance Group, would come down to an analyst and say, hey, what's the likelihood of occurrence we get hit by a denial of service attack this year? And the analyst, typing on the keyboard, looks up and goes, I don't know. I'll say 30%. Okay, great, 30%. All right, let's put 30% in there. Right? It doesn't mean anything, and it's frankly, it's garbage. So you get garbage out of it. and it's probably misleading, which is even worse. So the whole point with estimation is that you train yourself to understand your own biases, and then you can say, look, I don't, when was the Battle of Waterloo? Unless you're a history buff, you probably don't know exactly when the Battle of Waterloo was. But, if you have to come up with a range, you say, well, I think the lower bound is 1800 and the upper bound is 1900, right? And it falls somewhere in that range. And that's really what you want to do when it comes to calculating probabilities and loss for cyber security events specifically. And so you sit down and you think through these scenarios. You think through, when there's a phishing event, what does that cost us? Right? Well, it requires two people to do a little bit of investigation and probably burn down and reimage the machine, and they do it remotely, but it probably 2 hours. And we pay those guys and gals $150 an hour, whatever it may be. So on the lower end of the range, when we have a successful phishing incident, it costs the organization about $600. Right? On the other hand, if there's a phishing event and it goes undetected and there's lateral movement, they go deeper into the network and they get access to major sensitive data, or they're able to deploy ransomware, then the system outage could be pretty significant. It could cost us upwards of $50 million. And then when you tack on regulatory fees and penalties, depending on what industry you're in and what sort of governance you have, there could be additional amounts that you're having to pay, and the number could be really high. So you say, well, maybe it's I think probably be actually around 70 million, based on other organizations that have similar types of events and so forth and so on. And then someone says, oh yeah, but we have a cyber insurance policy. In the cyber insurance policy, our deductible is capped at $1 million. So actually the upper end of our range here may be $1 million, right? Or maybe not. But having the conversations with multiple stakeholders and being able to come up with ranges is really important, because then you can run Monte Carlo simulations, which is the third piece of the model. And the nice thing about this is you can do this in an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't require fancy software. It doesn't require any time. It literally a couple seconds in an Excel spreadsheet. And all that's happening here is you're taking one random value out of your range, and you're doing that a couple 100,000 times or a couple million times. And then out of all those values, you take the median value. And that is statistically pretty significant and pretty valuable. And that's what the output looks like. So then once you have those outputs, now you can communicate in a very specific way about what the risk is in loss terms. And what I find is that typically the first part of this process and the framework is pretty simple. It's pretty easy. The difficult and the challenging part is actually doing some of the evangelism in your organization to say, look, this is the way that we want to talk about risk. This is the model. These are the assumptions. These are the variables. And we want to be very specific in the way we talk about risk within cyber, because as you know, GRC is very good at calculating risk for all kinds of things in organization, financial risk, geopolitical risk. But when it comes to cyber risk, everybody says, well, we don't have perfect data. We don't have good models. We don't have good historical data. And the point is that you don't need that. What you need are some people that understand controls in the organization and some people that understand the threat landscape. And you can sit down and come up with very meaningful ranges that then feed into a model that can produce something very tangible. So this is what the output looks like when you run the model, right? So again, you're not seeing the inputs. I don't have time to show you the inputs, but we've done this with a lot of our clients. We sit down, we do the inputs, we run the simulations, and we get outputs that look like this. So what this means is that at the bottom of the chart, there's a 1% probability that this particular organization sustains a $31 million loss this year, right? A 1% probability that they sustain a $31 million loss. And then when you look right from there, you can see that 20 million of that is assigned to an exploited vulnerability column. And someone may say, I'm not comfortable with that risk. Or they may say, look, I'm not comfortable with a 50% probability of sustaining a $2.3 million loss this year. Where's that coming from? You say, well, $1 million of it's from commodity malware, right? Just based on what we're seeing right now in our environment and, how much malware we pick up. in a quarterly period, and what it takes, our SOC and IR team to triage. But you're able to, the point is that you're able to have a very specific conversation and understand where the risk tolerances are in dollar terms, in loss terms. And somebody may say, well, we're spending all this money. We have all these appliances. We have a 24/7 SOC. We have an IR team. Why are these numbers this way? Why do the numbers look like this? And of course, if you change the inputs, the outputs change. You say, well, look, if we didn't have those controls in place, if we didn't have policy controls in place for email and the web, if we didn't have this team or that team, these numbers would be substantially different, because the estimates, our input estimates, would be substantially different based on what we know about the environment. So the point here is that you can revisit this quarterly, you can revisit it biannually or annually, but you can change the inputs anytime your security controls change or the threat changes. And if you think the threat changes and there is a relevant threat delta there that impacts your security controls, then you come back and revisit the model and change the inputs, right? Which is going to change the outputs, which is going to change the conversation the next time you have it with senior stakeholders. So I talk about all of this in this book, The Risk Business, What CISOs Need to Know About Risk-Based Security. You can download a PDF from the Recorded Future website. If you prefer to read in hard copy, I am happy to mail you a hard copy book. I have a box of them sitting in my office here at home. Unfortunately, they're not on Amazon yet due to the COVID-19 situation. They're not, the fulfillment centers at Amazon are not running as they normally are. But if you want a hard copy of the book, I'm happy to mail it to you. Just send me an email. My email is levi@recordedfuture.com, and I would be happy to mail you one. I know that I like to read hard copy books. So what we talked about today, again, we talked about some of those paradigms, some of the buzzwords over the last 15, 20 years. We talked about what's happening today in digital transformation and the need for security intelligence. We talked about specifically how it reduces risk, both operationally and strategically. And last, I talked maybe provocatively about the business case for quantifying risk, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time and being here. I know that especially these days, everyone is super busy and there's a lot of competition for your time and attention, but I really appreciate you being here. And if there are any questions, I will turn it back over to John. But again, that's my email address down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And I'm happy to send you a book if that would be interesting and relevant for you.
Levi, thank you very much. We really appreciate that presentation. We're now moving on to the Q&A section. So as you have questions, again, we'd encourage you to navigate to the Q&A section of the taskbar and go ahead and type in your questions there. It looks like we do have one now for you, Levi. It says, a compliance-based approach has been the status quo at my company for as long as anyone can remember. How can I start getting coworkers to adopt risk-based security when the attitude is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And as I said before, the hardest part when it comes to quantifying risk, the hardest part is evangelizing the concept and really pushing other stakeholders, lateral stakeholders in the organization to think critically about how they communicate risk. And it's often very difficult. We have a couple clients, that are very invested. They're very invested in quantifying risk. We have a couple clients that have actually tried to implement FAIR. And I've talked to CISOs that have been at it for a couple of years, and they've told me, look, I don't have a lot to show for it. And that's really why TCR was put together, was designed to be practical and easy to use and really implement in a day or two and results to show, in a day or two. And I think, that becomes the easy part. Then it becomes the hard part, which to your question is, everyone's got to agree that there is a fundamental problem in the way that risk is being measured and communicated. And if you can't gain consensus that is an issue and a problem, then it obviously is going to be very challenging. I think today, this is early days in terms of risk quantification, cybersecurity. We're very much in early days. I expect this to become a much deeper topic over the next 10 years. As CIOs and CISOs, really want to better understand, security investments mean in terms of risk, and how it reduces risk so that they can better communicate to the board, right, in very specific and intangible ways. But again, it's not going to happen overnight, and fully recognize that it's not trivial.
Thank you, Levi. Looks like we have another question popping up. Can you shift to risk-based security with the same people and tools? What kinds of changes need to be made in terms of technology and personnel?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't need, new people and or new tools. I think one of the most helpful things for most information security programs would be potentially, if you're going to just hire or add one net new resource, it would be a data scientist or an actuary, right? But somebody who can basically just maintain the model for you, a risk model, and continue to probe and continue to ask good questions of the cybersecurity group. I think that's probably the one person that's missing across every organization I talk to. And if I was back on the other side and responsible for defending a network, I think that would probably be the person that I would be most interested in hiring to manage a risk-based model. But I don't think you're doing anything differently, right? With the people and the tools and the resources you have, it's really just a change in mindset. Again, in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and how you're going to accomplish it and how you're going to measure against it. It's less about the people, the tools, and it's really more just about shifting your mindset, right? And the only additional workflow piece is really revisiting your risk model. And the cadence that you do that, again, could be quarterly, could be biannually, but it's not super frequent, right? Because yes, adversary tactics are changing and techniques are changing, but in terms of the gaps that you have in security controls, those probably aren't going to be analyzed or addressed more than quarterly.
Thank you. The questions are starting to roll in now. I'd encourage folks to continue to put them in. What security can you provide against insider employee threats?
When you say you, is that a generic you or a you recorded future?
I think the recorded future is the gist of the question.
So it's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for how the recorded future platform specifically would funnel into like a DLP solution programmatically, or a data loss prevention solution. I do think that in the past, where you're seeing access being sold specifically in various criminal forms, there's oftentimes the thought that you may have an inside employee that's providing access or providing insight or information from an organization, and it's you're seeing it on the dark web for sale. But in general, I guess it would sort of depend on what the insider threat program looks like, and what kind of data the team is specifically looking to consume.
Thank you. The next question, is a threat-based approach ever the better option for an organization, like a conservative enterprise organization?
It's a good question, and I'm just thinking through it to make sure that I'm answering and capturing the scope of the question. So I think I'll give you an example. The legal industry tends to be very conservative. I can't think of an industry that's more conservative than the legal industry. And I would say, for an industry like that, obviously being threat aware is really important. But again, I don't think you want to focus on the threats without having an understanding of what your own security controls are first. And there's obviously a lot of things that you can do from a security control standpoint, just basic hygiene things that are going to make a huge impact, again, in terms of your security and what that does to risk and what it does to loss calculations, just being able to do some of those fundamental things. And obviously understanding, how adversaries are operating and what the threats are is really important. But I see it as, the next step for, organizations that really haven't invested much in security, there are precursors, I guess is my answer. And security intelligence is always going to be beneficial operationally. So you don't need a threat intelligence team. You don't need to think, oh, we have to go out and hire a bunch of people and put together a team. Strategic threat intelligence is great where you can do it, but operational threat intelligence is going to provide value even for those organizations that are more conservative. I talked about it in the presentation. Even implementing something around stolen credentials and implementing a workflow around stolen credentials, it becomes a security control in and of itself. So I think that kind of operational threat intelligence is going to be valuable, regardless of where you are in your security journey and sort of, how conservative the organization as a whole can be.
Excellent. Thank you, Levi. I don't have any more questions appearing right now. If we can move to the last image. Access IT would like to thank all of our attendees and, of course, our presenter, Levi Gundert, for this presentation on risk-based cybersecurity. If our attendees have additional questions, or if you'd like to discuss creating a customized security solution for your organization, please contact Access IT via the following paths. Access IT Group is committed to supporting our clients during this challenging time. We want to thank everyone for attending today, and of course, our best wishes for your safety and health for you, your families, and your fellow employees. Thank you.